Welcome to today's special briefing from Downing Street. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Jenny Harries, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. Today I'm going to concentrate on our plans for the autumn, for schools, early years and further education. Getting our children back to school is a vital part of our national recovery from the COVID-19 outbreak. Our children's future depend on it. They will be the doctors, the teachers, the engineers of tomorrow, and we must make sure that they are able to achieve their dreams. More and more parents are being reassured by the measures that we are taking to keep their children safe and are letting them return to schools and nurseries if they're eligible to do so. As of this week, there are more than 1.6 million children back in our schools. If you're one of those parents, I'd like to say thank you for putting your trust in us. I know many of you have had doubts and may still do. I want you to know that I treat my responsibility for your children with the utmost seriousness. Their safety, their well-being is my top priority. In welcoming more children back, we have followed not only the best scientific advice, but also what other countries have been doing to manage a successful return for their children and making sure we do the same here in the United Kingdom. At my last briefing, I told you how it was my intention for all children to be back in school for September. Today, I want to give you more detail about how we're going to make that happen. But before I do, I'd like once more to thank the fantastic school and college staff, the childminders, the nursery workers and carers who are all making a return possible. Schools, nurseries and early year settings have been welcoming more children back since the 1st of June. They've been keeping children in small, consistent groups with stringent infection control, hygiene and cleaning measures in place to make sure that they're safe. Now that infection rates are falling, we can relax these bubbles, and from the 20th of July, we can lift the restrictions on early years settings, who will be able to return to their normal group sizes, although other safety measures must remain in place. We know that keeping contacts to a minimum is still one of the best ways to reduce risk of infection. And from this autumn, when the whole school population returns, we're asking schools to make sure that they continue to minimise contacts. This should be done by distancing where possible and by keeping classes or year groups separate from one another. We've suggested, for instance, that schools may stagger the start and end of the school day and that they keep their corridors as free from congestion as possible, minimising movement of children. We've issued full guidance on the approach schools and colleges should take, and I expect them to apply this in a way that works most effectively for them, their students, but also their wider communities. We know that maintaining distance and bubbles may be more challenging in schools where children and young people have special educational needs and disabilities, so we've issued specific guidance for them. If anyone in a nursery, school or college develops COVID-19 symptoms, they can already be tested. But from September, we're going to give all schools and colleges a limited number of home testing kits to give to any children or staff who are unable to get to a testing centre. Parents expect their children to be safe in school, but they also expect them to be getting a first-class education, which is why from September we'll be asking schools to resume a broad and ambitious curriculum. And we expect exams to be going ahead in the summer of 2021. We want children to be getting back to normal and enjoying school and benefiting from it. We all know that the best place for children to learn is in school, which is why I've been so determined to get them back there as soon as we can. From September, attendance will once again be mandatory, and no child should be out of school unless it has been agreed. This will be crucial if we are to minimise the effect of this pandemic on every child's long-term educational development. I've already announced a £1 billion COVID catch-up package to help children make up lost ground, including a £650 million catch-up premium for state-funded primary, secondary and special schools, and a £350 million national tutoring programme for the most disadvantaged pupils. I'm confident that by adopting this carefully planned return in September, we're going to be in the best possible position to recover and rebuild our education system and ensure that none of our children lose out. By working together, we will make sure that their hopes and dreams for the future are not to be knocked off course. It's now an opportunity to take some questions, and I'd like first of all to go to Jamie from Manchester.
Given that schools could be subject to localised lockdowns come September, what steps are being taken to improve students' access to online resources? As a teacher myself, I know this to be a massive hurdle in maintaining student progress, particularly in high pupil premium areas.
Well, Jamie raises a really important point, and this is why we've been rolling out over 200,000 laptops for children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, understanding that they may not have those resources at home for them. But on top of that, creating the online resource and support that children need in terms of the Oak National Academy. We're looking at how we can continue to build on this so it benefits every child. Next, we go to Leanne from Bournemouth, who asks, please can you advise how wraparound care, breakfast, after-school clubs, co-curricular activities will be able to be facilitated if year groups cannot be mixed? This is extremely important for parents to know, as many working families rely upon this in order for them to be able to work. Leanne makes a really important point. We recognise how vital these breakfast clubs are, the wraparound care and provision are for children, for parents, for families and for whole communities. That's why we've been issuing guidance to guide schools to be able to make sure that they make this available for parents, for children, because we've all seen with our own children how much they benefit from them. And we want to see these opening alongside the full opening of schools in September. And we're also going to be ensuring that the many activities that often take place on school premises during the summer holidays are going to be taking place. And we've been sharing that guidance with schools so they can benefit from that as well. Next, if we can turn to Branwen Jeffries at the BBC. Branwen.
Looking at what's happening in Leicester, where teenagers are a growing proportion of the cases, aren't you now more uncertain than you were a week ago that having all children back all the time in groups of up to 200 or 300 won't increase the level of transmission? And following on from that, given that they're going to have a year of disruption of classes, year groups being sent home, how can you say that they're going to have a world-class education?
Branwen, I think we all know how important it is to get every child back into school so that they can really start benefiting from a world-class education, being in the class with their teacher, learning, having that experience of being back with their friends. And we have to have the absolute concrete determination to deliver that for every child. But we recognise that we have been in an enormous fight to defeat this virus, and we will have to ensure that we continue to take action to keep on top of that. And that's why we've seen swift action in Leicester, and if we need to take further action elsewhere, we will do so. but ensuring that we have a continuity of education that's delivered in every school is absolutely vital. I wonder, Jenny, if you can comment on Leicester in terms of
yes,
what's
thank
happening
you, Secretary
there.
of State. So I think for Leicester, clearly it's not just the teenagers. What we're seeing is a community transmission, a rise in cases across the community. And I think it is, sadly for Leicester, it's a very good lesson for the rest of the country in a way, which is how we all need, as we go forward with the easing of lockdown measures, still to be really careful about how we interact with others, about social distancing, about washing our hands, all the things we've heard of. But in relation to the age group, you're quite right that when SAGE, for example, originally looked at the risks, and it still continues to be the case, younger children are very definitely appear to be less of a risk. Younger people overall do not experience serious illness themselves. But what the guidance that the Department for Education has developed has done is worked with Public Health England to ensure that it's not just guidance about what is happening in schools, but it is actually about things like transport, around advising families to, if you like, control their teenagers when they're outside coming in. And in fact, the original guidance recognised that the transmission risks were potentially more in the social behaviours of the teenagers, the older children out of school than they potentially were in school. So I think probably it's a real message to the schools are quite a controlled environment, and perhaps trying to encourage families as well to, I know it's difficult because I've been there, but to try and control their teenagers in their social interactions outside school as well.
But schools are also social spaces. And if you have 200 or 300 teenagers together who haven't seen each other for months, they are not going to be social distancing. They're not going to be observing the precautions which you're advising the rest of the population to do to minimise risks.
Well, we recognise that there are challenges, but we cannot underestimate the importance of getting every child back into school. We cannot underestimate the value that our children going back into school brings, not just them, but the whole of society. And that is why we cannot sit back and we cannot be in a position where we just say that children are not going to go back to school. And that's why we've created a system of controls to minimise the risk, minimise the spread of transmission, and making sure that children can return to school safely with controls in place and reducing the chance and the risk of any virus being transmitted. And I think Jenny's probably better to comment on this, but what happened in Leicester was not something about schools returning. Schools play an incredibly positive part and role in the wider society, and it would be very misleading to imply that they had a role in terms of any form of spread in Leicester.
Yes, so I think just picking that up, as I've said, we have a community transmission picture in Leicester. There are clearly pockets around the areas where we could see perhaps more cases, but it's very much through young people and working age people right across. So this is not a picture of a particular focal point, and certainly not on schools. And I think just going back to the point you raised and the ones that I did previously, just to reiterate, schools are actually quite controlled environments. They're a bit like workplaces. In many ways, we should be more concerned with what the teenagers are doing outside school. So if they are in school, in a controlled environment with hierarchies of control and people keeping an eye on them, if you like, that's probably a much lower risk than if they were out of school doing their own thing.
I think it's fair to say, Branwen, as a father with two teenage daughters, I think that school has far more control over my daughters than I've ever been able to achieve. But thank you ever so much. If we can move on to John Ray at ITV. John.
Secretary of State, why has it taken you 4 long and lost months to come up with these guidelines? Guidelines which, according to the school I've been in today, well, they're left with profound doubts as to whether they can make them work in time.
Well, John, I'm not sure if you noticed, but we saw a return. We've already seen a return of over 1.6 million children getting into school. We've seen primary schools right across the country opening up. We've welcomed back reception, nursery, year 1, year 6, years 10 and 12. And we've seen this cautious, careful, phased return. And we saw that first stage of children returning to school. But we recognise that as we have moved forward, as our battle against this virus has become ever more successful, that we're now in a position where we can actually welcome more children back into school, and where we're going to be in a position in September where every child in every school is going to have the benefit of enjoying every class that they want to be enjoying. And that's why we're now in a position to be able to welcome them back. And that's why, after a number of weeks of consulting with stakeholders who've seen that first phase, that cautious, careful phase of children coming back, that we're able to say that in September we're going to be able to welcome back all children.
Can I just pick up, sorry, briefly on the point that Brian was making? I think parents will want absolute clarity. After what's happened in Leicester, are you telling parents that there is absolutely no additional risk sending their children back into groups of maybe 250 pupils?
John, what we've seen in terms of return of schools is we've seen, as Jenny has highlighted, with the creation of safe environments, and that's the type of environment that we are going to be creating as every child returns back to school in September. But Jenny, I'm not sure if there's anything further you would like to add to
I mean,
John.
there's an obvious point which we can't guarantee absolute safety for anybody anywhere in the UK. So I think we just need to be very realistic. But I think your starting point was around why now, why not earlier? And certainly as a public health professional, I would have been quite concerned if this had been put forward in the first few weeks when we had an uncontrolled epidemic in the UK. But I think most importantly, we knew far less about the transmission of the disease, and particularly how it affects children. So we know a lot about how it affects children. Very few children have severe illness. And so the risk here is around transmission. And as the Secretary of State said, the guidance which is there, and I think it's... teachers are quite right. They're looking at it, I think, and thinking, how do we implement this in the setting that they have? So there is a degree of flexibility, but running beneath it are principles of control. And they are the same ones we should all be applying in society. So walking down a corridor, a very brief transit is very unlikely to give you any significant risk. But if you are keeping children where you can in segregated groups, you will minimise the number of interactions. So these are the same principles that apply whether we go to a retail outlet now, whether we're walking in our town, and schools are very controlled environments. So the safety element is built into the system, and I think, it's not my area, but I'm very sure that from conversations that I've had with some of the teachers working with Department for Education, that teaching sites, providers, are finding very innovative ways to manage that, particularly, for example, in the summer. Actually, you can have a group of children in a lesson outside, and that reduces your risks instantly. So I think lots of innovative ways and lots of teachers putting those forward.
But John, just to emphasise to your viewers that the safety of those children going into school and those who work in school is absolutely our top priority. But we mustn't at any stage forget about the value that schools bring to every child, and actually how much we all need to ensure that every child is back into that classroom. If we can next go to Fatima from Channel 4. Fatima.
Thank you, Secretary of State. You mentioned the government issuing laptops to disadvantaged students. We've had a survey carried out from Channel 4 News of 800 head teachers. More than half of them say they haven't received these laptops. This morning I was filming at a school where they told me they can't carry out live lessons online because some of their children just don't have the internet, don't have laptops that they can use. What is your message to those head teachers and indeed to those children who have been left waiting?
Well, Fatima, we engaged on one of the most ambitious programmes in terms of distribution of technical equipment, in terms of laptops and also internet routers. We've seen over 202,000 of those distributed to local authorities and multi-academy trusts, who then pass those on to the schools. We've got 10,000 orders that are still outstanding, which will be fulfilled over the next few days. But there are a number of local authorities and multi-academy trusts who have as yet not placed their orders, but we're chasing those up, and We've made this investment to give children the best possible advantage, and we'll be working with the education sector to make sure we deliver on that. Next, if we can go to Anna from The Telegraph. Anna.
Secretary of State, pubs will be reopening this weekend, but all children won't be back to school until September. And when they do, they'll have a watered-down curriculum in many subjects. Has the government got things the wrong way round? And are you concerned that you're failing a generation of children?
So, Anna, I don't want to pick you up, but, there is not going to be a watered-down curriculum. It is going to be a full and total curriculum that is going to be delivered for our children across all subjects. It's incredibly important that we have the same standards and rigour within our education system as we come out of lockdown, as we had going into it. And we are not going to be in a situation where we are going to see vital subjects cut out of children's education. So the idea that there'll be a watered-down curriculum is totally untrue. And schools will be held accountable as a result of Ofsted inspections. And the key element, as I'm sure that you are fully aware of, in Ofsted is the quality of the curriculum and the teaching of that curriculum. So if schools are not delivering on that, they will not be succeeding in their Ofsted.
Could you answer the question, though, about has the government got its priorities the right way round between pubs and schools?
Yeah. Well, the reality was that the reality is that we've got 1.6 million children back into schools already. If we had been in a position where we could have had all children coming back into school before the summer, I have to say there is no one who would have wanted to see that more than I would have done. There's no one who would like to see every child back in school in their class today. But we have been dealing with a global pandemic. And when we were in a position to make the decision about having that phased, cautious, careful return of children, we weren't in a position to say that every child would able to be back in school before the summer. But what we are going to do, because you know and your readers know how important education is, the impact it has on their lives, and that's why every single child will be back in school in September. Thank you. And if we can next go to Kate Ferguson at The Sun. Kate.
Hi, thanks, Secretary of State. You failed to stick to your promise to bring all primary school children back to school before summer, in part because of the opposition of some heads and councils. Can you promise now that the date won't slip again? And what action will you take against heads and councils who refuse to reopen at the beginning of September? And if I could just ask Jenny Harris, if the country does have another COVID peak this winter, could we see another national school shutdown recommended? Thanks.
So, Kate, what we see today is we see virtually every single primary school right across the country open. We see all local authorities now accepting the fact that they have to work with us in order to ensure that all schools are open. And while we didn't want to, we had to highlight to some local authorities the fact that we did have powers and we would use those powers to ensure that all schools open up for those pupils in those year groups. And as we move into September, we're working very closely with the sector. I have absolute confidence right across the board. Everyone accepts the fact that we've got to deliver full-time education for every child in this country. But if we are not in a situation where people are operating and opening schools, we will have to take very specific action to ensure that they do. Jenny.
Thank you. Yes, so I think a second wave is quite a possibility. That is not ruled out at all. A second peak, as in an epidemic peak, another one is also not ruled out. And in fact, in pandemics, you can sometimes see successive ones. So we're talking about a second, but you can get waves on waves. And we're starting to see, I think, if you look at the maps across the world, you can see these peaks now rising in regions and falling and some rising again. So the important message message, I think, for the UK and for England and schools particularly, is that everybody's worked really hard to get past this peak and bring it down. And what we're seeing in Leicester now is what is much more likely to happen as we go forward, and that's positive in some ways. It may not feel like that if you live in Leicester at the moment, but what it should reassure parents, particularly in schools, is that where there are local rises that we start to see, that the focus of energy is on ensuring that they do not become another peak. So they're little small ones, if you like, around the country in this first wave. And if we keep on top of them right across the country and keep doing that, there may be a temporary closure for a short while, as we're seeing there, and open up. We're much more likely then not to have a national shutdown in the future. And it's not just schools, of course, that we only do that if it's essential to manage the risk to the public and particularly to keep children safe.
Kate, I'm not sure if there's a further question you'd like to ask.
Gavin, can I just ask you about that second question? Would you rule out another national school shutdown?
Well, as Jenny highlighted, the fact that we've already seen in Leicester that where decisive and clear action needed to be taken in order to be able to dampen down a local spike, that's what we did. And that's the whole approach that the government's taking. And by taking that clear, decisive action to ensure where you see those local spikes and we have the data and we have the information so we can monitor it, we're willing to take it. And by doing that, we ensure that we avoid the situation where we will ever have to see a national shutdown again. But the value importance of education is right up there to ensure that children are not in a situation where they're not having the benefit of being in school. But we have been clear to schools that if for a reason that you do see a local shutdown, and if in the unfortunate situation that some schools have to close in that area, they have to have those clear continuity of education plans so that education can move as seamlessly on as possible. If we can move to Rachel from the Huffington Post. Rachel.
Hello, thank you, Secretary of State. Can I ask you two questions, please? The new guidance for schools published today says that if a child tests positive and is asked to isolate for 14 days, schools should offer remote education, but it is the case that a lot of children simply don't have access to a laptop at home. Can you guarantee that by September, every child who needs a laptop will get one? And secondly, a Public Health England report found that people from Black and minority ethnic groups have a higher risk of death from coronavirus. Are you doing anything specific to reassure BAME parents it is safe to send their kids to school? And are you really going to fine them if they don't?
Yeah. So Rachel, firstly, we've made a big investment in terms of technology. We've seen that rolled out to schools. Schools are in a position to be able to support children that maybe have to isolate. There will be some children, due to their specific health conditions, that may not be in a position to be able to return to school as normal as a result of those underlying conditions that they have. And that's a conversation that they would have to have with their doctor and also with their school, so that we're able to work with that child and actually be able to support them. But we have set out clear expectations in terms of how we expect and will work with schools for them to be able to support children much more broadly. I'm not sure if, Jenny, you were able to comment on the...
So obviously the factors around risk variables, how much risk there is associated with your age or your ethnicity is new learning to a large degree, which we're working continuously on. For most young children, actually, the risk is very similar. Your ethnicity is, for the child themselves, is probably very similar across different ethnic groups. It gets more pronounced in terms of risk term for older patients, which are the ones you're referring to, who've often come into hospital and have differential outcomes from treatment. But I think we are, as we go forward, we are looking at those children, for example, who may have specific conditions who need additional support. Now, at the moment, people in the shielded patient group, those ones which are the most clinically vulnerable, are not in school. We're advising they do go back after for the September term, except in an area, for example, where we've seen raised transmission rates, and in those cases we will contact them ahead of that. So effectively, parents can be assured if they have children with high risk characteristics that when September term starts, if there are any local issues about that, those children will be advised. But mostly for most children, risks are very, very low right the way through. So they should be going back to school. And as Secretary of State has said, really important that they go back into their education for their long-term health.
And Rachel, just before we move on to Freddie, schools have a lot of experience of working with families and communities and working with them to ensure they have maximum attendance as possible. And we'd expect this sensible approach. We've got to be clear that being in school, being in education has enormous benefit to every child. And we have to get back to the fact that we do have a compulsory education system. But schools will use good common sense in terms of working with families, dealing with some of those concerns that they may have in order to ensure that every child is back in school. Next, if we can go to Freddie from Schools Week. Freddie.
Thank you, Education Secretary. A lot of pupils, particularly those at rural schools, rely on public transport to get into school. Doesn't your plan for bubbles fall apart when children are crammed onto buses to and from school every day? And given the importance of this, why are you still evaluating your position on providing extra school transport services? Why don't you have a plan already? And a second question, if I may.
Use them both at once, please, Freddie.
Yes, you're reintroducing mandatory attendance and with it absence fines for parents, as you've said. This puts head teachers in a potentially really difficult position of having to authorise absences of pupils where parents feel it's not safe for their children to return. Will head teachers be penalised if they sympathise with these parents and authorise absences for this reason?
Yeah. So Freddie, in terms of school transport, this is an issue that we've been working very closely both with the Department for Transport, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and we'll be working very closely with local authorities in terms of making sure that depending on where we are in terms of dealing with this virus, that the proper controls are properly in place on school transport. And some of the information that we're sharing is making sure that the protection of those bubbles is in place as a result of home to school transport. Going on to the issue of we have to get to a position where there is compulsory education for every child. And if we are not in a position where we are saying that there is an expectation of every child to be in school, unless there is a good and proper reason for it, some of the children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds are the ones that are going to suffer. And you know as well as I do that it is not the first step that schools move to in terms of fining parents. There's a whole series of steps working with local authority guidance to be able to work with those families, to deal with those concerns and make sure that we have attendance of all children. But if we want to make sure that those people from the most disadvantaged communities do not suffer, we have to ensure and make sure children more broadly do not suffer. We have to be clear that attendance at school is something that is expected of every child unless there is a good and proper medical reason for them not to be in attendance. Well, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everyone for joining us today and wish you all the best. Thank you.